The White House just handed us the most important sentence spoken about Iran in weeks, and almost nobody is properly explaining what it actually means. Here it is. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, speaking from the podium today, said this: "This is a battle between the Pragmatists and the Hardliners in Iran right now." Stop. Read that again. The official spokesperson for the President of the United States just publicly confirmed on the record that Iran's government is fighting itself. Not metaphorically, not as a diplomatic talking point, as an operational reality that is directly shaping whether a deal gets done or whether this conflict escalates into something far more dangerous. Now, here is what that sentence means when you unpack it, because the mainstream coverage is treating it as a background detail when it is actually the entire story. The United States government does not publicly announce that a foreign government is divided between factions unless its intelligence community has confirmed that division is real, that it is active right now, and that each faction is making competing decisions that are pulling Iran's official position in opposite directions simultaneously. When Washington says that out loud, in a press briefing, on camera, it is telling you something specific. It is telling you it knows which faction is which, it knows what each one wants, and it is betting that public acknowledgement of the split can be used as a pressure tool to push the pragmatists into the dominant position before the hardliners lock in an outcome that makes a deal impossible. That is an extraordinarily aggressive and revealing piece of public diplomacy, and it happened today. Leavitt also confirmed that Trump's ceasefire extension, announced this week, was, in her exact words, Trump generously offering a bit of flexibility to a regime who has been completely tarnished because of Operation Epic Fury. And she confirmed that despite the ceasefire on kinetic military strikes, what she called Operation Economic Fury continues in full force alongside the naval blockade. So let me tell you what we are going to cover today. We are going to break down exactly who the pragmatists are and who the hardliners are inside Iran right now. We are going to show you what U.S. intelligence almost certainly knows about this internal battle that Leavitt's statement is drawing from. We are going to explain why Trump's ceasefire extension is a precision tool aimed directly at empowering one side of that battle. And we are going to tell you what happens to the rest of the world depending on which side wins. Hit subscribe right now and turn on every notification. Iran's internal power struggle is moving faster than daily headlines can track, and every update matters. To understand the battle Leavitt described, you need to know who these two factions actually are, because the words pragmatist and hardliner mean very specific things in the context of Iranian politics, and the difference between them is the difference between a deal and a war. Let me start with the hardliners. The hardliners in Iran are not simply people who are stubborn or ideologically rigid. They are specifically the faction centered on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the clerical establishment closest to the supreme leader's inner circle. Their position on the current crisis is consistent and has not changed regardless of military or economic pressure. They believe the United States cannot be trusted to honor any agreement it signs, and they have historical evidence for this position in the 2018 JCPOA withdrawal. They believe that making nuclear concessions under military threat sets a precedent that permanently weakens Iran's deterrence posture. And they believe that Iran's asymmetric military capabilities, the mines, the fast attack craft, the drone networks, the proxy forces across 4 countries, give Iran enough leverage to survive the current pressure without capitulating to American demands. The hardliners are not suicidal. They are not seeking war for its own sake, but they are willing to absorb economic pain for a longer period than Washington's timeline assumes. And they are betting that America's domestic political tolerance for a prolonged, costly Gulf confrontation will crack before Iran's regime does. Let me know right now. Comment deal if you think Iran's pragmatists win this internal battle and a negotiated framework gets done within the next 2 weeks. Comment war if you believe the hardliners lock in Iran's position and this conflict escalates beyond the current ceasefire. Drop it below. I read every single comment. Now the pragmatists. The pragmatist faction inside Iran is centered on the technocratic and diplomatic establishment, the foreign ministry professionals, the economic policymakers, and the political figures whose domestic credibility depends on Iran's economy functioning at a level that keeps ordinary Iranians from open revolt. These are the people who, according to multiple diplomatic sources cited by Reuters and the Financial Times, have been the driving force behind Iran's participation in the Islamabad talks. They understand the mathematics of the blockade better than the IRGC commanders do. They are watching the foreign currency reserves drain in real time. They are watching inflation running above 43%. and they are calculating that the economic trajectory Iran is currently on leads to internal political collapse faster than external military pressure would ever achieve. The pragmatists are not pro-American, they are pro-survival, and their calculation is that a deal, even an imperfect deal, even one that requires painful nuclear concessions, is survivable for the regime in a way that economic collapse is not. Here is what makes this internal battle so consequential for the rest of the world. According to diplomatic sources familiar with the Islamabad process, Iran's negotiating positions have been visibly inconsistent between sessions, sometimes showing flexibility on uranium enrichment timelines, sometimes reverting to absolute refusal of the same terms.
That inconsistency is not confusion. It is the visible symptom of two factions pulling Iran's official position in opposite directions at the same time. The pragmatists move the position toward flexibility. The hardliners pull it back. Washington watches the oscillation and tries to time its own moves to land when the pragmatists are in the ascendant position. That is exactly what today's ceasefire extension is designed to do. Let me tell you precisely what is happening inside Iran's political system right now, because the signals coming out of Tehran in the past 72 hours are the clearest picture we have had of this internal battle since the conflict began. Start with what the pragmatists have been doing. According to 3 diplomatic sources cited by Al Monitor and confirmed independently by the Financial Times, Iran's foreign ministry has been conducting back-channel communications through Omani intermediaries at a pace significantly higher than at any previous point in this crisis. The volume and frequency of those communications, not their content, which remains confidential, but the sheer operational tempo of the engagement, is itself a signal. It tells Washington that someone inside Iran's system is working urgently to keep the diplomatic channel alive and functional, despite the hardliners' public position that talks cannot proceed while the blockade is active. That someone is the pragmatist faction, and they are working urgently because they understand something the hardliners are either ignoring or discounting. Iran's economy does not have unlimited time. According to financial data compiled by the Institute of International Finance and reported by Bloomberg last week, Iran's usable foreign currency reserves have declined by approximately 34% since the blockade began. At the current rate of depletion, economic analysts estimate Iran has between 4 and 7 months before its ability to finance essential imports, food, medicine, industrial inputs, becomes critically impaired. The hardliners can survive that timeline politically. The pragmatists are not sure the country can. Now here is where the ceasefire extension becomes a precise instrument rather than a diplomatic gesture. When Trump extended the ceasefire, Levitt was explicit about the framing. It was described as generously offering flexibility. That language is not accidental. It is specifically designed to be quoted inside Iran, to give the pragmatist faction a talking point they can use in internal debates. America extended the ceasefire. America showed flexibility. The military pressure has paused. This is the window to negotiate before it closes. The ceasefire extension did not change the military reality significantly. The naval blockade continues. Operation Economic Fury continues. The carrier strike groups have not moved. But it gave the pragmatists something they desperately needed inside Iranian internal politics. A narrative that engagement is producing results, and that the hardliners' total refusal posture is not the only option on the table. But while the pragmatists were working the diplomatic back channels and the ceasefire extension was being processed through Tehran's political system, something else was also happening that tells a completely different story about which faction is currently winning. According to defense analysts tracking open-source Iranian military communications, the IRGC's operational posture in the Strait of Hormuz has not softened during the ceasefire period. Fast attack craft patrols have maintained their elevated frequency. Mine-clearing operations by U.S. Navy assets have encountered continued Iranian interference. And according to maritime intelligence sources cited by Lloyd's List, the authoritative maritime industry publication, at least 4 commercial vessels have received what are described as unprofessional interactions from IRGC naval units in the past 5 days, meaning harassment that stops short of seizure but communicates continued Iranian willingness to threaten commercial shipping. That is not the behavior of a military command that has received orders to stand down pending diplomatic progress. That is the behavior of a military command that is operating on its own timeline, independent of whatever the foreign ministry is communicating through back channels in Oman.
And that gap between what Iran's diplomatic establishment is signaling and what Iran's military establishment is doing is the most precise measurement available of how the internal battle between pragmatists and hardliners is currently going. When a country's military and its diplomats are moving in different directions simultaneously, the political leadership has not yet made a final decision about which faction's advice to follow. That decision is being made right now. And everything, the price of oil, the safety of American citizens in the region, the future of the nuclear program, depends on which way it falls. Let me give you one more data point that makes the urgency of this internal battle concrete and measurable. According to commodity trading analysts cited by Bloomberg this week, the oil futures market is currently pricing in a 34% probability of a significant Hormuz disruption within the next 30 days. That number, 34%, is not a geopolitical assessment. It is money. It is traders with billions of dollars at stake making a mathematical bet on the probability of this conflict escalating. 3 weeks ago, that same market probability was 19%. The movement from 19% to 34% happened almost entirely in the past 10 days, precisely the period during which Iran's internal battle between pragmatists and hardliners has been most visibly unresolved. The market is not watching the military hardware. It is watching the political coherence of the Iranian government. And what it sees is a government that cannot yet decide what it wants. That indecision is being priced into every barrel of oil sold on every trading floor in the world today. Every day the internal battle continues unresolved, that probability number moves higher. And every point it moves higher, the economic pressure on every country on earth that imports oil increases, whether or not a single additional shot is fired in the Gulf. Here is what U.S. intelligence almost certainly knows about Iran's internal battle that informed Leavitt's public statement today, and what that intelligence tells us about how Washington is actually playing this moment. According to diplomatic sources cited by Axios and the Wall Street Journal in the past week, the U.S. intelligence community has developed what analysts describe as an unusually detailed operational picture of Iran's internal political dynamics since the conflict began. That picture, sources say, includes assessments of which specific Iranian officials are in communication with which foreign intermediaries, the general content of those communications, and the relative influence of different factions in Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the body that formally sets Iran's negotiating positions. That level of intelligence detail does not appear in press briefings, but it shapes them. When Leavitt says battle between pragmatists and hardliners, she is not speaking generally. She is speaking from a specific intelligence picture that tells Washington who is up, who is down, and which direction the internal argument is currently moving. We have learned from sources familiar with the U.S.-Pakistan diplomatic channel that Washington delivered a specific private message to Tehran through Islamabad in the 48 hours before the ceasefire extension was announced. The message, according to these sources, was calibrated precisely at the pragmatist faction rather than at Iran's government as a whole. It communicated that the ceasefire extension was being offered specifically in response to signals of genuine engagement from the Iranian side, signals that Washington could only have received if it knew which individuals inside Iran were sending them. That is not standard diplomatic communication. That is Washington reaching past Iran's official government directly to a specific internal faction, telling the pragmatists that America sees them, that America is responding to them, and that if they can move Iran's official position, America will reciprocate with further flexibility. A secret deliberation took place inside Iran's Supreme National Security Council, according to 2 regional intelligence sources familiar with its general contours, within hours of the ceasefire extension being announced publicly. The participants included representatives of both factions. The IRGC commanders argued that the extension was a sign of American weakness, proof that maximum pressure was working, and that holding firm would eventually produce even greater American concessions. The pragmatist officials argued the opposite, that the extension was a genuine signal and that refusing to respond would eliminate the diplomatic window entirely and leave Iran facing an economic trajectory that the military could not arrest. The session, according to these sources, ended without a definitive resolution, which means the supreme leader has not yet given final direction to either faction. And an undecided supreme leader, in Iranian political terms, is the most dangerous condition of all, because it creates a vacuum that both factions will try to fill through unilateral actions on the ground that present the leadership with facts rather than options. The IRGC filling that vacuum with aggressive behavior in the Strait is not coincidence. It is a faction trying to make the military reality on the ground determine the political decision at the top.
Let me explain why Washington's public acknowledgement of Iran's internal battle is either a brilliant strategic move or an extremely dangerous one. Because serious analysts are genuinely divided on this, and you need to understand both arguments. The case that it is brilliant goes like this. By publicly naming the Pragmatist faction and framing the ceasefire extension as a response to their engagement, Washington has done something specific. It has raised the political status of the Pragmatists inside Iran. It has given them public credit in American government statements, which will be quoted across global media and received inside Iran for whatever diplomatic progress has been made. That public credit makes it harder for the hardliners to dismiss the Pragmatists as naive or ineffective. It gives the Pragmatist faction a verifiable external validation they can use in internal arguments.
And it creates a dynamic where refusing to deal with America now means actively overruling a faction that Washington has publicly identified as the constructive one, which carries its own political cost inside a system where appearing as the obstacle to peace has real consequences. Follow the incentive this creates. If Iran's pragmatists can produce a deal framework and point to Washington's public acknowledgement as evidence that engagement works, they win the internal argument by demonstrated results rather than theoretical argument. That is far more powerful politically than any position paper. Now the case that this is dangerous. By publicly identifying and empowering one internal faction over another in a foreign government, Washington has done something that authoritarian political systems find deeply threatening. It has made a domestic power struggle internationally visible. The hardliners inside Iran's system will read Levitt's statement not as diplomatic outreach, but as American interference in Iran's internal politics. And interference in Iran's internal politics is the most reliable way to activate Iranian nationalist sentiment across all factions, including among pragmatists who are genuinely interested in a deal, but cannot afford to be seen as responsive to American pressure domestically. In short, Washington calling out the pragmatists publicly may have just made it politically harder for those same pragmatists to deliver the deal Washington wants them to deliver. Because no Iranian official who wants to survive politically can be seen as the faction that America is rooting for inside an Iranian power struggle. There is a third dimension here that almost no analysis is covering. The IRGC is not just a military organization. It is an economic empire. According to estimates published by the U.S. Treasury Department and corroborated by independent financial analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the IRGC controls somewhere between 20% and 40% of Iran's formal economy: construction, telecommunications, energy, banking. The blockade is not just squeezing the Iranian government's revenue, it is squeezing the IRGC's own financial interests directly. And a military organization whose economic empire is under attack has an incentive to escalate that is completely independent of ideology or strategic calculation. The hardliners are not just fighting for Iran's nuclear program. They are fighting for their own balance sheet. That makes them considerably more motivated and considerably less flexible than any purely strategic analysis would suggest. Understanding this financial dimension of the hardliner position is essential to understanding why they will not simply back down because the economic pressure is severe. For the IRGC leadership, backing down does not just mean losing the nuclear argument. It means losing the economic control structure that has made them the dominant power center inside Iran for the past 2 decades. That is not a concession any faction makes voluntarily. This is what analysts will call the visibility paradox. The more publicly Washington identifies and supports the pragmatist faction, the more domestically toxic that support becomes for the pragmatists it is trying to help. And the more the hardliners can point to American statements as evidence that the pragmatists are serving foreign interests rather than Iranian ones. The legal and constitutional dimension of this moment matters too. The ceasefire extension means Trump has now personally committed to a temporary halt on kinetic military operations. Congressional members who have been pressing for war powers consultation are watching whether that commitment holds. If the IRGC conducts a major provocation during the ceasefire period and Trump responds militarily without authorization, the constitutional confrontation that has been building for weeks arrives at exactly the moment when it is hardest to manage, while a delicate internal Iranian political process is still unresolved. Here is what happens to the rest of the world depending on which faction wins Iran's internal battle. I want you to follow both scenarios carefully because the difference between them is not marginal. It is enormous. Scenario 1. The Pragmatists win. Iran's foreign ministry, empowered by a supreme leader decision to pursue a negotiated framework, produces a formal response to Washington's terms within the ceasefire window. The response includes meaningful concessions on uranium enrichment levels and stockpile disposition. Not everything America demanded, but enough to constitute verifiable progress. Washington accepts this as the basis for a new round of talks. The naval blockade is partially eased. Operation Economic Fury begins a phased wind-down tied to specific Iranian compliance milestones. On the surface, this sounds like the good outcome, but here is what it actually means in practice. A deal achieved under these specific conditions, with the hardliners undefeated inside Iran's political system, with the IRGC's capabilities intact, with Iran's nuclear knowledge and infrastructure remaining fully in place, is a deal that the hardliners will spend every subsequent month trying to undermine. Every verification dispute becomes an internal political weapon for the IRGC faction to use against the pragmatists who signed the deal. Every American action anywhere in the world that Iran perceives as hostile becomes ammunition for the argument that the pragmatists were naive. The deal gets done, but its durability depends entirely on whether the pragmatist faction can maintain political dominance inside Iran. And Washington has no tools to ensure that. Scenario 2. The hardliners win. Iran's Supreme National Security Council produces a formal rejection of the current American terms, framed as a defense of Iranian sovereignty against military coercion. The ceasefire expires without a new framework. The IRGC, freed from the political constraint of active negotiations, escalates its Strait of Hormuz operations. Additional ship harassment, possible mine deployment, activation of Hezbollah pressure in Lebanon to open a second front. Oil crosses $110 per barrel within days. The economic impact of Scenario 2 reaches every country on Earth simultaneously. Japan, South Korea, Germany, India, the major energy importing economies face immediate supply disruption costs, measured in tens of billions of dollars per week. Their governments face domestic political pressure to condemn American policy and call for de-escalation, fracturing the international consensus that the blockade has depended on for its political legitimacy. China, watching the Gulf coalition crack, accelerates its shadow oil purchasing from Iran at even deeper discounts and signals to the global market that it will not participate in enforcement of the blockade, which effectively ends the blockade's economic effectiveness regardless of its military continuation. Russia, in either scenario, wins. If the pragmatists produce a deal, Russia positions itself as the essential custodian of Iranian nuclear material, the broker without whose cooperation no verification framework can function. If the hardliners prevail and the conflict escalates, Russia benefits from elevated energy prices, weakened American strategic bandwidth, and deepened Iranian dependence on Moscow for economic and military support. Russia entered this conflict as a bystander. It exits as a power broker regardless of outcome. That is not an accident, it is strategy. China is calculating the same variables from a different position. Beijing needs the strait open for its own energy supply, but benefits from American strategic distraction. It will not intervene to help Washington. It will wait, import discounted Iranian oil, and use every hour of American focus on the Gulf to press its own agenda in the South China Sea and across the Indo-Pacific, knowing that America cannot fully attend to both theaters simultaneously. There is one more implication that domestic American audiences need to understand clearly. The ceasefire extension that Trump announced, the one Levitt described as a gesture of flexibility, is already facing criticism from two completely opposite directions simultaneously inside Washington. Republican hawks, particularly those aligned with pro-Israel advocacy organizations and with a maximalist view of what the Iran policy should achieve, are arguing that extending the ceasefire signals weakness and gives Iran's hardliners time to regroup and prepare military options rather than negotiate seriously. They want the pressure maintained without pause. On the other side, a growing number of voices in both parties are asking why Operation Economic Fury is continuing during a ceasefire, arguing that a ceasefire that maintains full economic warfare is not a genuine ceasefire, but a rebranding exercise that gives Iran no actual reason to reciprocate with diplomatic flexibility. Both criticisms are coherent. Both point to a fundamental tension in the current American approach, trying to signal flexibility and pressure simultaneously, trying to empower pragmatists while punishing the country those pragmatists govern. Whether that tension can be sustained without it becoming politically untenable inside Washington is itself a variable that Iran's internal factions are watching and calculating around. Let me tell you exactly where this goes in the next 72 hours, because Leavitt's statement today, when you read it carefully, actually gives you the timeline. She said the ceasefire is an opportunity for Iran to produce a unified response. That phrase, unified response, is doing enormous work. It is telling you that Washington knows Iran's current response is not unified. It is telling you that the ceasefire extension exists precisely to give Iran's internal process time to produce a unified position. And it is telling you, implicitly, that if that unified position does not emerge within the ceasefire window, the military and economic pressure resumes, fully, immediately, and without a further extension. Trump is not being generous. He is being precise. The ceasefire extension is a clock, exactly like the original ceasefire was a clock. It is a defined window inside which Iran's internal battle has to resolve itself, or Washington makes the resolution irrelevant by removing the conditions that make negotiation possible. The pragmatists inside Iran understand this. They are working against a deadline that their own hardliner colleagues are trying to let expire by default. Every day that passes without a unified Iranian response is a day the hardliners win by inaction. They do not need to produce an alternative proposal. They simply need to prevent the pragmatists from delivering one. That is the trap Iran is in right now. And it is a trap that Washington designed deliberately, because a regime divided between two factions cannot negotiate coherently. But a ceasefire gives the weaker, more flexible faction time to organize. Remove the ceasefire and the IRGC's operational dominance reasserts itself automatically, because military commands do not require internal political consensus the way diplomatic processes do. Expect the next 48 to 72 hours to be defined by signals rather than statements. Watch whether Iran's foreign ministry schedules any formal communication with the Pakistani intermediary channel. That scheduling, even before any meeting occurs, signals the pragmatists are still functional. Watch whether the IRGC conducts any significant provocation in the Strait during the ceasefire period. Any such provocation signals the hardliners are actively trying to collapse the diplomatic window. And watch whether Trump makes any additional public statement directed specifically at Iran's, quote, pragmatists. Any further direct address to the faction by name signals that Washington's intelligence picture shows the pragmatists losing ground internally and that America is trying to compensate with public validation. The battle Leavitt described today is real. It is happening right now, inside closed rooms in Tehran, with enormous consequences for every person on Earth who fills a gas tank, pays an electricity bill, or lives in a region where this conflict could spread. The outcome is not determined. The ceasefire gives the pragmatists a window. Whether they can use it before the hardliners close it is the question that determines the next chapter of this story. We will be tracking every signal in real time. Every update goes here first. Iran's internal war between pragmatists and hardliners is being decided right now, in the next 72 hours. The ceasefire clock is running. The signals are moving. If this breakdown gave you the real story behind Leavitt's statement today, hit the like button right now. 1 second. It puts this analysis in front of the people who need it. Subscribe and turn on every notification. The moment Iran's unified response arrives, or the moment the ceasefire collapses, you will get the full breakdown here before anywhere else. Stay on it. This one moves fast.